So a couple of weeks ago, Josh started us off on chapter 3 and did a fantastic job from what I heard and what I hear. And so that means, though, that we are in the second part of James chapter 3. And the book of James is laid out in a really, really topical kind of way. So last time when Josh taught, we were talking about the tongue and the things that you say. And this time, we're going to be talking about showing wisdom. All right, so it sort of jumps from one topic to the next, although they're related. So we're just really going to jump into the text first and read through this and then go from there. So this is starting in verse 13. And he says, "Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not what comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." All right, so this whole chunk it's about wisdom, okay? And starting back at the beginning of that, just like in every other paragraph that we've studied from James, James just immediately sort of gets down to the practical part. He's not telling you, he's not asking you to, tell him about your faith. He's saying for you to show him your faith. All right. And so James really doesn't ask you to hear the word of God or anything like that. He asks you to do the word. And so this morning, when James talks about wisdom, he's not asking you to show how wise you are by what you can, like, communicate eloquently about what you believe. He's asking you to show how wise you are by the things that you do. And so he's making a connection between wisdom and behavior. And the fact is that you can kind of tell a lot about what a person understands in a personal way about God by observing their life. And so the wisdom that guides us is just evident by the way that we live. And it's important that we understand a couple of things about wisdom itself, I think. And he says, "Who among you is wise and understanding?" So wisdom and knowledge are not quite the same thing. Okay, so knowledge is important. It's important to know things. It's important to know things about God. It's important to understand things about how to study the Bible and stuff like that. Okay, so things like that do matter to the life of faith. And they do matter to the cultivation of wisdom. But wisdom's not the same thing as knowledge. And wisdom is a quality that one can develop that's like irrespective of your IQ or what you know or anything like that. It's a little bit, it's actually quite a lot more subtle than that. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about this morning because James is actually presuming that his readers clearly understand this difference. And we're a little bit removed from the Jewish wisdom literature anchor that the audience had that James was writing to. Okay, so we need to go into this for a minute. And so wisdom is a perspective that's formed in the heart. Okay, it's an attitude. It's an outlook. And knowledge is like when you can sort of like count a thing and you know how many are there. It's like measurable. And wisdom is more like knowing what it means to have a certain number of whatever. Okay, it's more about connecting the dots so that the world that we live in makes sense to us in a way that means that we can sort of live victoriously. Okay, that's what a wise person does. It's a practical understanding of the significance of things. And so it really does come out of the heart. And wisdom also presumes a certain kind of spiritual softness. And so the Proverbs describe wisdom in a very cool way. So we're going to look at a handful of Proverbs about wisdom because they sort of just get right at the heart of what this is all about, and they are exactly what would have informed the understanding of James when he considered what's meant by wisdom. Okay, so Proverbs 8 says, "Does not wisdom call and understanding lift up her voice?" Okay, so see how wisdom is sort of personified? It's not like an abstract thing. It's like a person here calling out. Okay, and then it says, "Blessed is the one who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at my doorposts." So this is like painting a picture of us having these hearts that are really soft towards the things of God. And God is speaking here. He's speaking the words of wisdom, and he's calling on us. He says that blessed is the one who's able to set aside the noise of life and listen. So there's this concept that the Bible refers to in the wisdom literature, and so that would be especially in the Old Testament. And so we're talking about Psalms and Proverbs and parts of Job and Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon even. And that's the fear of the Lord. Okay, and so this is not the idea that we're really afraid of God. It's more like reverence for him. And so God is God, and when he speaks, it really matters a lot. Okay, and so there's a reverence there's an attitude of the heart where if God has something to say, then I want to hear it. I almost need to hear it. And so that's what the fear of the Lord is. And the Proverbs say, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." So God has some wisdom for you, and only those who are soft-hearted towards him can really grasp it and put it into practice. And so this is saying that there is a starting point. Okay, that starting point is asking what it is that God has to say. It's a really important question. And so in the next chapters, James is going to unpack some important life issues. All right, issues like resolving personal conflict and how to deal with your work life and how to think about your material possessions and suffering. Okay, and so what am I supposed to do with suffering? These are really, really important questions, and they're questions that wisdom comes to bear on. And so this starting point is, what does God have to say? And that would be versus, how do I feel about things? Okay, so we kind of want to come up with our own plan, and we just hope that God's going to get on board or whatever. And we make up our mind, and we barrel through various doors, and then we say that God opened the doors. Okay, and so we actually mostly need to sort of take a step back and ask ourselves what it is that God has to say about that and seek him out along the way. And so this softness of heart becomes really important, and with it comes an understanding of what God is leading us towards, and God is able to then lead us when our hearts are soft. All right, so the next thing is the hard part about gaining wisdom, and it means that you have to be open to correction. Okay, there's a humility involved in wisdom, and the Proverbs say about this that he who neglects discipline despises himself, but he who listens to reproof acquires understanding. before honor comes humility. All right, so this idea here is that we're not really born wise. Okay, we're born foolish. We're born self-interested and self-centered and self-serving and self-absorbed and every other kind of self, like whatever. And we just kind of have to learn otherwise. We have to subject ourselves to correction about essentially the entire condition of our heart. And so most of us have kids. And I think that if you have kids and you pay any attention at all, you can attest to the fact that this is true. Okay, kids are entirely absorbed by what they want. They're not born wise. Okay, they're foolish. And it's our job to train them to be wise. And so some of us never entirely get that lesson. Okay, we may be brilliant or expert in various things, but we may also be very foolish. And so that's kind of what Socrates was saying when he said that the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. Okay, wisdom is all about your attitude. And that's what he's talking about here, all right? If we're going to cultivate real wisdom, then God is going to have to do a little bit of work on our heart in order to prepare the ground for his guidance and for his leading. And so if we are gaining wisdom from God, it's going to shape the things that we're able to see. That's it's an important component to this, I think. There's a contrast to this in Proverbs 3 and 16. So Proverbs 3 says, "In all your ways acknowledge God, and he will make your paths straight." Okay, so this is talking about an attitude where we're looking to God. And as we look to him, he sort of illuminates the way forward. We look to God and he shows the way, all right? He makes it clear. And on the other hand, Proverbs 16 says, "There is a way that seems right, but its end is the way of death." Okay, it sure seems like this whole thing makes sense, where we work jobs that we don't like to buy stuff that we don't need, and where we're mostly concerned with ourselves and our primary goals all involve the American dream, but not God's will, and we can barely recognize a difference. All right, and so all that may intuitively seem like the right way, but it leads right to death because it's not God's way. Okay, this is a real live contrast that's set up here, and we need to understand that there's a work in our heart that God is seeking to accomplish so that we'll be able to experience wisdom in our lives. Okay, so Paul says a very important thing in Romans chapter 1. He's talking about people that are scoffing at the gospel, and he says they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but became futile in their speculations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. All right? The point that Paul's making is that we need to understand, all right, it's important what he's saying there. There are really intellectual issues that people have, that spiritual seekers have, that get in the way of them understanding who God is, all right? People do have questions, like if, God is good, then how come there's evil in the world, all right? Questions like that. Those are important and they're appropriate questions to ask, but they're not usually the real issue. Okay, the real issue that separates people from God is a spiritual issue. Okay, it's an attitude of the heart. It's a lack of softness towards God because we sense that God is a threat to our own self-rule. Okay, we come into the contemplation of God already with a certain level of negativity, okay, with a certain amount of pushback, with a certain knowing that we're invested in ourselves and that we would rather God kept his distance from us. And so if you talk to most atheists for a while, you'll see that their arguments really boil down to the fact that they don't like the way that God has done things. Okay, so they refuse to admit that he's even there. It's not usually really intellectual arguments that convince them in the end that there is a God. Okay, it's these issues of the heart. And so I actually have one atheist friend who was honest enough about this issue to say out loud that he knows that he would have to reprioritize his entire life if he admitted that there was a God. All right, and so it's generally not really an intellectual issue, but that's often how it's framed. Okay, so people often live for many years in tension with this issue because of the condition of their own heart. And so many times people have kind of a negative take on Christianity, legitimately. Maybe there are some things that happened in your life that formed these negative associations. But those negatives about the church and about Christians are cultivated and reinforced in your own heart. Okay, I'm one of those people. Okay, I have more reason that I need to separate myself from Christians and the church. Very real things happen to me and in my life, but I can tell you that I cultivated an attitude against the church. Okay, I used that as an excuse to turn from God. Okay, so maybe you know what I'm talking about. All right, maybe you can relate on some level. And, maybe now's a time when there's sort of a fresh opportunity for you to begin a dialogue with God. Okay, even here this morning, to begin thinking through that maybe it does seem reasonable that there's a God. Maybe one of the reasons that you're not seeing him is not because he hasn't revealed himself, but because you've turned a blind eye to him. Maybe you could ask him to open your eyes to see what he's really saying to you. All right? It's an important place to begin spiritual seeking. Okay, it's on this heart level. So the intellectual things matter, but this heart thing, it's usually the thing. And so, are you really prepared to hear from God? If you understand something to be true, are you really prepared to make the necessary shifts that they require? Okay, are you willing to trust Christ with your life? So those are real questions. So a second preliminary issue that we need to look at in what wisdom is that it's not knowledge in an abstract sense. It's more of a practical understanding, and the way that James describes it is interesting. I think it is that it becomes evident by the way that a person lives. So you can tell who's wise and who's foolish by the way that they live. And he brings up two qualities of it here. He says, deeds done in the gentleness of wisdom. And so this word gentleness is protes in the Greek. And it's saying that the mark of a person who knows God and whose understanding of life is being shaped by God is a person who's cultivating humility. Okay? And this is because they're being trained. They're allowing themselves to be corrected. They're allowing God to shape their values and the lens that they look at the world through. And this produces a humility that says that they're interested in hearing what God has to say. And their first inclination is not to think of what's in it for them, but to think of how God is revealing himself and what he's calling them to. Okay, that's humility. There's an observation with the wise person that they're not pushy or arrogant, right? There's like a genuine humility about them. And the second thing here is that he says that they have good behavior. This is a horrible translation. All right, so the Greek word kalos is translated here as good. It actually means beautiful. And what this says is that a wise person demonstrates their wisdom by the beauty of their life or by their actions. Okay, this is about the attractiveness of a wise person's life. So biblical wisdom is not at all like Yoda, okay, living alone for centuries in a cave. Okay, it's a person that, because they have this vital thing going on with God and this willingness to allow God to shape their heart, they become a little bit more like what God is about. Okay, they become attractive to the people around them. People sort of gravitate to them. They give off a sense of being a safe person to be around and of having genuine care for the people around them. Okay, there's a real draw towards a person who's wise because we can see in their life that there's substance there. All right, so the proverb says this, and again, this is wisdom personified who's talking, and it says, "Blessed is the one who listens to me. He who finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord, but he who sins against me injures himself. All those who hate me love death." Okay, those who hate wisdom love death because they're left to their own devices to figure things out. Okay, that's going to go badly. So right there's the framework that James sort of brings to the table as he's talking to these people about wisdom. We're going to unpack a little bit where he goes with this. And so this is starting up in verse 14, and he contrasts two kinds of wisdom. He takes a look at the implications that these two kinds of wisdom have for our lives. He says, "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not what comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing." Okay, so this is the one kind of wisdom here, where it says this wisdom is not what comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. So we're going to get to describing this in a little bit greater detail in a second. And so he's saying that there are implications that if your starting point is this wisdom that's earthly, natural, and not from God, then it's going to create an effect in you. Okay, your inner life is going to be shaped around bitter jealousy, selfish ambition, arrogance, disorder, and every evil thing. Sounds bad. Okay, that doesn't sound like the way to go. But this is an example of James's very black and white way of communicating. All right, and so then he contrasts that with verse 17, the wisdom from above. Okay, this is the wisdom that we've been describing from the Proverbs, the wisdom that's oriented in the person of God. And this wisdom also has implications in terms of how it shapes the lives of the people who are driven by this kind of understanding. Okay, you can see those implications underlined in the verse here. And so we're going to kind of bring this together, and to aid that process, I built you a graphic. Okay, I know, it's amazing. No need to comment. All right, so there are two sources of wisdom here, right? Worldly wisdom and spiritual wisdom, with two very different results. And one is in the life of the ego, and the other is a sort of freeing humility. And James is basically laying out that, like, these are your options. Okay, you have to pick one. What kind of person are you interested in being? What kind of wisdom are you going to seek? And so here's how this works. So first, he's really talking about a perspective. Okay, wisdom is not just knowledge. Okay, it's important to know facts like history and science, but those are not wisdom. Wisdom is a perspective that we bring to those things, and it's why those things matter. Okay, what's the significance of those facts? And how do I relate them to my life? Okay, you can't measure those questions in a lab or whatever. Those questions are beyond that. These are questions that humans ask, all right? It's a perspective. That's wisdom. So how do you process life? That's really what's being asked here. Everyone's looking through a certain kind of lens for how they're supposed to deal with the important parts of life. Okay? So like the conflicts that they face in relationship. James is going to talk about that. We get to it next week. Okay, we're going to discuss some issues about how to deal with interpersonal conflict and how wisdom comes to bear on that. Okay, so how is it that we view the person that we're in conflict with? One option is that we view them as an irritant. And with our limited time and energy, the best thing to do is to rid ourselves of the irritant. Okay, even if that irritant is a spouse or a close friend. Okay, or we could say that in conflict we believe that there's something that God wants to teach me that's part of his plan for my life. Okay, that's a very different lens. Also with our work life. Okay, how do we process the demands of our work as they compete with our time and energy at home or as servants of Christ? James is very interested in that question. I hope that you are interested in that question. Okay, wisdom bears on how we answer that. Same thing with wealth. Okay, there's a perspective that you can bring to wealth that says that, like, I earned it, it's mine. Okay, and I'm sovereign over my stuff. The one who does with the most toys wins. Okay, whatever. Another perspective is that the wealth that I possess is really the possession of God, who owns all things and has entrusted to me for a little while some of his stuff for me to be the steward of. Okay, it's a very different perspective. Suffering. Nobody likes suffering. The word means that it's going to suck. Okay? So it's going to be bad. And so to be miserable physically or to be like in agony within yourself, what do we do with that? Okay? We want to make it go away. That's one perspective. We have a right to not feel bad. Okay, and so another way of looking at it is that suffering is the consequence of living in a world that's broken. But it's a world that God is involved in putting back together and redeeming. God has allowed me to suffer so that I can better understand the brokenness of my neighbor. Okay, so that as I learn to trust God in these difficult parts of my own life, I'm opening a window where people can see through my behavior the wisdom that undergirds my life. Okay, and so in that way, my willingness and my attitude towards suffering actually is a very important part of what God is trying to do through me as a witness to the world. Okay, it's a bit of a different perspective. And so James is going to break all these things down, and he's going to touch bases with the wisdom that comes from above, and he's going to apply it to each of these situations. And so what we're doing today is actually laying the groundwork for these future conversations that James is going to bring up. So James says that the wisdom of the world is earthly, okay, versus this wisdom that comes from above. And so earthly wisdom is temporal. It says that you have this limited amount of time. Okay, and in that time, I'm just going to have to get for myself all the things that I can. And so if sand is running through the hourglass and that's all you get, then it's pretty important that you get out there and get the experiences that you want, okay, before you're 70 or 50 or 30 or 15 years are up. Okay, and we don't know how long we get. And if all you have is now, then that's going to have a huge impact on how you view the world around you. The wisdom of the world is earthly, and the wisdom from above has an eternal perspective. Okay, that says that God's involved in the affairs of our lives, and the things that he brings to us now have implications that go beyond this life and beyond ourselves, all the way into eternity. Okay, so this is a huge shift in perspective from the temporal point of view. So secondly, James says that the wisdom that's not from above is natural. Okay, so the word in the Greek, I think it's psychikos or something like that, it just means unspiritual. Okay, it's drawing attention to the material nature of things. So this is a wisdom that arises from a simple observation of nature. That's what he means by natural wisdom. And this is set in opposition to a supernatural outlook that says that God is involved. Okay, we live in a supernatural world. Things are not just a matter of cause and effect. We cannot say that things are just the way that they are, or that I am just the way that I am. Okay, we have to decide if we believe that God is active. And if we calculate our lives and our perspective based on if God is involved, then we're going to come up with very different conclusions about how to deal with those important parts of our life. If we're calculating that it's basically all up to us and we just have to do the best that we can, then that's also going to give a very different point of view. Okay, what difference does it make that there's a God that's involved in our lives when it comes to the issues that you face in your life? Okay, that's what James is trying to get us to consider here. And again, his way is very practical, all right? You've got people around you that you're in conflict with. The natural perspective might be that you're just incompatible. Okay, your psychological profiles don't match. But, God's outlook is that he's greater than those differences that separate you from other people. And God is able to be at work even in the situation of conflict. And he's able to make you better. So, do you believe that God is in the mix? Or do you believe that it's all up to you? Okay, you decide. And where you land on this is going to determine the expectations that you have for the breadth of your life. Okay, how you live, what you're able to see, and how you put things together. Can you look back at your life and see just a bunch of random events that don't really mean anything? That's a very natural point of view. Okay, you're here by accident for a certain number of years based on biochemistry and circumstance. And then you're gone. Okay, there's no point at all. Any meaning at all that you superimpose on life is entirely arbitrary and made up. And the point of your life is the same as any fungus. Okay, you come into existence, you do what your organism demands of you, and then you cease to exist. Or, God is involved in my life. God is active, and he's sovereign, and the things that come into my life are a part of his provision for me. They're part of his desire to shape me into the person that he designed me to be. And therefore, I can respond with a certain enthusiasm about even the difficult things that life has for me. Totally different perspective. Okay, it's a different wisdom. James says that the wisdom that's not from above is earthly, natural, and demonic. Okay, and probably what he means is that it's based on the lie that drives the cosmos. Okay, it drives humans and drives personalities away from God. The central lie that affects all of human history comes out of Genesis 3, where the serpent, the demon, approaches Eve and calls God a liar. Okay, he says that this whole thing about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it's bunk, man. All right? You will not die if you eat from it, he says. It's just God trying to suppress you. God's trying to deprive you of something that's good. Okay, there's a wisdom to be had, and God is trying to keep that from you. You cannot trust God. Okay, and the rest of human history is just really an outplaying of that reality. And so here's the thing, like there is a fundamental contention in the universe, okay? And it's not whether or not there's a God. That's a smokescreen. Okay, the contention is God good? Is God's will for your life a good will? Are the things that God allows to come into your life, even if they're difficult things, good things for you? Can the painful things in life bring out gratitude because they come from or are allowed by a good God? All right, so these three things, temporal versus eternal, whether or not God is active in the circumstances of our lives, and whether or not God is a good God, these questions that James is bringing up are like the key issues that determine if you're going to cultivate real, life-changing, life-giving, satisfying wisdom. Okay, you can cultivate a perspective that will allow you to meet any challenge with hope and with confidence and with a sense of victory. All right, a perspective that's going to give life to the people around you. Or you can cultivate a perspective that will allow you to be destroyed by the circumstances that life dishes out. Okay, those are the two choices that you have for paths that James is laying out here. All right, two kinds of wisdom. One of them starts with self, the other comes from above. Now we're going to apply these things. James has given us the perspective, and he's laid out our options, and he's going to apply them because the perspective that comes from the world, these things that are like natural and demonic, they are so intuitive. Okay, the things that the world around us is about, you don't have to do anything to gain this kind of perspective. All you have to do is not resist the thought patterns of our culture. Those things are all rooted right within it. And to have the wisdom of God from above, a supernatural outlook where you trust in a good God, these things have to be actively engaged, actively pursued. Okay, passivity is the real problem. Okay, this is the real difference between a person who has knowledge and a person who has wisdom. A person who has knowledge, knows that God is good. All right, if they understand their life as a Christian, they know that God is sovereign and good, but they don't know how the goodness and sovereignty of God relate in a practical way to their life. Okay, and so they live in the exact same way as everybody else. All of the studies show that this is exactly the case. Okay, places like the Roper Organization and other polling organizations study the American church and the attitudes and the buying habits and the aspirations and the ways of living of the people in our culture so that they can learn how best to advertise to them. Okay, so that they can effectively sell us stuff. But they're very astute in showing that there is no measurable difference between the attitudes about marriage or career or family, wealth, things like that, within the Christian community from the attitudes outside the Christian community. It's just a fact. Okay? And so why is that, do you suppose? I'll tell you what I think. It's because we, as a composite, are knowledgeable but unwise. Okay, to become wise means that we would have to actively engage with God. We have to actively seek that open heart and that willingness to be instructed. We would have an active willingness to be corrected as he speaks to us through his word and through prayer. Okay, and that means that we would have to use a little bit of time available for our active pursuit of him. But most of us don't have very active habits in our spiritual life. And because of this lack of an active seeking of God, we're passive about all these things, and we end up being just like the world around us. Okay, that's why the believing church has less and less influence in America on the broader culture that we live in. Okay, the world's not just getting darker and darker. Okay, we are becoming more and more like it. Okay, and so how about you individually, right? Maybe you could think about that. Maybe we all need to think about that. So let's finally get to the implications of this then. The result column that we have pretty much neglected at this point. James points out that if we start with the perspective that the world presents to us, the result will be a life that's characterized by jealousy, selfish ambition, and arrogance. Those are what he says. Okay, and so what's he talking about? The first thing that he talks about is jealousy. And jealousy is the idea that you're not content with what you have. Okay, maybe you spend time fussing about what you could have and are kind of preoccupied by the things that you could have. How is it that we feel about the success of other people, or the possessions of other people, or their abilities? I mean, honestly, really? You know what I mean? When someone else at work gets like an advance, like they get to move up in the job, how do you feel about that? Right? Is your first line of thinking that they wouldn't have gotten that promotion if the boss knew what I know about them, right? They sure made a mistake by promoting that person, right? Are you envious sometimes of the abilities of the people around you? People can draw beautiful things and make beautiful music and make things and think about things in certain ways and communicate in beautiful ways. And man, I wish I could do that. Really isn't fair that I can't do that. Jealousy and envy are when you see in other people things that you would like to have for yourself, and you sense that you don't have it, so you're competitive about it. Or maybe you're contemptuous about it. Whatever. Jealousy is really about wanting someone else's stuff. Okay, so you visit someone's house and, you're comparing your crap to theirs, right? Their TV's bigger, but my kitchen's nicer, right? So I know that none of you are like that, but there are people in the world that are, and so this is a perspective that they bring. They lack contentment with the things that they have, and so they obsess about the things that other people possess. Selfish ambition is different, right? This is the concern for how things advance your interests versus a selfless concern for the interests of others. So the way of the world is to look out for number one, right? It's choosing relationships that advance my cause. Okay, it's choosing people that build me up, choosing directions that are pleasing to me. And, there's nothing really inherently wrong with that. But if that's all there is, there's this grain of self-interest and propping yourself up in all things, really, then you're not going to find selfless concern for others, all right? You will never find the time to roll up your sleeves and really give yourself away to people who are not going to be able to love you back. Okay, this is like the reason for the coldness of our culture. And we do have a cold culture. All right, it's better in the South than it is north of here, but like people come from around the world and they often notice just how alienated we are from one another. Okay, do some traveling in other parts of the world and you're going to find that many other cultures have people that interact with one another in fairly personal ways. Okay, and so why are we alienated more than other people? It's not just because of this value that we have for individualism, although that's part of it. It's because we're mostly self-interested. And how many people that are self-interested can find themselves comfortably rotating in somebody else's universe? Okay, so the late Alan Bloom said in his book, The Closing of the American Mind, that everyone loves himself most, but wants others to love him more than they love themselves. That's the world that we live in. Okay, are we selfishly ambitious? I mean, how would we even know? Okay, do we find that in our lives we have an ongoing and deepening interest in the lives and concerns of other people? I mean, people that we cannot benefit from much at all? We just present ourselves as servants to? Then there's arrogance. I have very much enjoyed the burden of thinking about this for a couple of weeks. And now I have the great pleasure of dumping that burden on you. I think that maybe we're pretty quick to categorize other people as arrogant. Okay, but if we're actually asked to define what makes a person arrogant, I think we tend to dance around the parts of this that might apply to us. Okay, so being as objective as I could bring myself to be, I would say that the things that we should look for here are whether or not we're able to admit your faults. Do you even know what your faults are? Okay, if you cannot name some pretty serious and pretty precise faults of yours pretty quickly, you might be arrogant. Okay. Are you unteachable? Do you have it all figured out and have no need to hear from somebody else? Are you critical? Are you dismissive? Do you write people off? Do you write off the things that people say? Are you ungrateful? Do you have the disposition in your heart that you're not thankful? Do you recognize the things around you that God, in His mercy, has given you because He loves you and because He's interested in your development? Do you hold grudges? I think that contemplating some of this stuff is painful. Are you a wise person, right? Are you able to identify and admit your faults? When was the last time that you approached another person and admitted that you were out of your mind and completely full of yourself in this particular area and that you would like to apologize? Right? Because it must be really hard to be around me sometimes. An arrogant person cannot do that. Okay? An arrogant person is unteachable. You can't sit down with them and lay out the things of God's Word that would help with some of the things in their life that you've observed in them. They don't receive the insight. They blow you off or they get angry. Okay, it's just arrogant. to not be soft towards people who are trying to move towards you with concern and with compassion and with interest in your life. And to the extent that that describes you, you've got a problem with arrogance that's rooted in the perspective that you bring to an understanding of yourself. Okay, so that's what James is saying here. Do you gross yourself out sometimes? I think that's actually a pretty good test of your own self-awareness. Okay, so I have people in my life that love me enough to play back the things that I say and the things that I do, even though I will act bad in retaliation. All right, and for me, it's a measure of my growth in this area that I regularly find myself in the place where I'm pretty grossed out by the things that I say and do. Okay, I can see the arrogance and the envy and the selfish ambition. And, you know, that's movement in the direction of health because it's true. All right, in your twisted and broken heart, that's what you are apart from the mercy of God. And the extent that you can see that is the measure of the amount of biblical wisdom that you're bringing to the table. Okay, it's when we can recognize that and we're able to seek out more of the wisdom that's from above that James says is pure and peaceable and gentle and reasonable, merciful, steadfast, and non-hypocritical. Okay, so that's all the good stuff from those verses smashed onto one slide. I'm not going through them. Okay, they're all things that we think we are, but we aren't. Okay, so let's wrap this up with a couple of thoughts. How about if we are a people whose behavior and outlook are characterized and shaped by humility? Okay, James says that's the key marker of what wisdom is. Okay, a gentleness, an approachability, a generosity of spirit. Okay, that's what a gentle person is. Okay, are you a generous spirit in the lives of the people around you? Steadfast means that you're not like radically up and down. There's a consistency about your life. Purity is a love for the truth, of love of what's good. To be not hypocritical in the sense that you like say one thing and you really live out something very different. Okay, reasonable means that there's a sanity about you where you're measured in your speech so that when you say something, it's like sensible. Okay, that's kind of what a biblically wise person is like. Also shaped by grace. And this means to be merciful because God is merciful. To be peacemaking rather than contentious, and rather than being constantly unresolved in conflict and constantly moving away from people because you can't resolve things with them. Okay, that's what God's about. The central message of the Bible is that we have a problem with God. Okay, we've gone our own way and we've adopted the outlook that we've described this morning. We've become this arrogant, self-possessed person that James describes. And that's a problem. It's a problem with the God who is our creator and who has created us in order to relate to him. All right? But the good news is that in his mercy, not because we deserve it, but in his mercy, God has moved towards us. In the person of Christ, he's taken it upon himself, all of the burden of guilt, of yours and of mine. Okay, he's offered us total forgiveness. It's not okay to just be good from here on out. Okay? It's total forgiveness for all the things that are offensive to him. Okay, that's what grace is. He accepts us because of the gift of his son's death on the cross, not because of anything that we do. That's the gospel, right? That's the good news. And if you've heard that message before, that's what the Christian message is, okay? It's not about cleaning up your act. It's not about making resolutions or promises. It's not about being better. Okay, it's about being forgiven. So that's something that God offers you, and you can take him up on that anytime, okay, or even right here this morning. Just tell him that you're interested in forgiveness and that you sense your own guilt. Ask him to apply this death on the cross that paid for sins to your situation of sin. He'll be all over it, okay? So a person who understands grace is able to cultivate a wisdom in their dealings with people. They understand deeply just how forgiven they are, and so it becomes very easy to extend some grace and mercy to other people. And so if you find yourself disconnected from people because you've judged them as unworthy and you've determined that they are of limited value to your agenda, right? They're just too complicated and messy to be worth the time, then the thing that you need to understand is that all of those things are true of you to God. Okay, from God's point of view, you're pretty high maintenance. Okay, yet he loves us and he continues to move towards us. And a person who understands that is able to do that with other people. Okay, that's wisdom. So I'm just going to ask you to think about the relationships that you have where you could develop some of these things. Okay, I think that we would be way ahead if we could listen to James on some of these points. All right, and do you have a longing to bring God's wisdom to bear on your life? If you do, then God is eager to grant you that wisdom. Okay, he really wants you to become a person who sees things from his perspective and whose life is shaped by a perspective that gives life. Okay, so that's the concept stuff on wisdom. And then over the next 4 teachings, we're going to sort of break this down into the very concrete places that we find ourselves in life that we mentioned earlier as we work our way into the middle of chapter 5 of the book of James. All right, so that's it for today. And